Per a source, something that has been talked about a lot in the last year is coming true. UConn is joining the Big 12. This is a crossover with Locked On UConn and Locked On Big 12.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome to a crossover edition of Locked On UConn and Locked On Big 12. Thank you for making these shows your first listen every single day. That is Mark Zanetto of Locked On UConn. I'm Drake Toll from America's #1 Big 12 podcast, Locked On Big 12. If you hit subscribe, we get to keep our jobs. On today's show, UConn heading to the Big 12 in new expansion. That's the question. That's the report. We'll also talk if it makes sense for both parties. And finally, who's coming with them? Because there are very few schools that act alone in expansion and realignment. Mark, let's waste no more time here. UConn to the Big 12. This is something that you're hearing reports of on your side. Give the full scoop of what you've got in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, thanks, Drake, for having me on. I appreciate you. It's simply where there's smoke, there's fire. You know, we talked a little bit pre-show about it, that a good friend of mine reached out to me, and he's up in Connecticut. He deals a lot with boosters, with some folks in that world. And I see how old I am. I say boosters when it's like Norn NIL collective. And he said that, you know, it could be as soon as 2 weeks, but that in his words, it seems imminent. He also sent it to me and said, could be a good segment for you in the pod. So it's one of those things where I feel like this is something that's been building over time, and we discussed a little bit why I believe that this is likely going to happen. Whether it happens in 2 weeks remains to be seen.
Now, the imminent word is one that immediately catches my attention, and any source that reaches out and you say, you know what, there's something to this. And moreover, if you simply Google, pre-show doing my notes, there are so many articles from Ross Dellinger to Brett McMurphy that mention UConn in terms of Big 12 expansion, where the conference wants to go. Let's talk UConn. Let's pose it for your standpoint, your listeners, the people who matter on the Huskies side. How does this make sense for a school that's had so much success, especially on the basketball side in the Big East?
You know, I think it sounds crazy, but I'm on board. But I think I'm in the minority here. And I think part of that is there's a nostalgic push. There was the dead years in the AAC, the American Athletic Conference, right? And the push to get us back into the Big East was made by Gino Auriemma from the women's team, and then with Dan Hurley and his resurgence of the men's team to become the national power that it truly was before he was there. And almost resurrected to the point now where we're thinking about a three-peat. Crazy to even say that out loud again. There is a lot of people that would. The reason why it hasn't happened already is because I feel like there was such a push to go back to the Big East that a pivot to the Big 12, it's almost too much change for the UConn to kind of wrap their head around. But I do feel I've done a few shows on this that they have to start thinking about the future. And if the future is, you know, talking about this for next year or the year after that, but we announce it sooner than later so people know where we're going to secure that future, I think that's what makes the most sense financially. We'll work out the logistics later.
From a football standpoint, then, if you're UConn, I mean, I don't foresee the Big 12 taking just basketball from a school that has football. I mean, Gonzaga obviously is a different story. You've got to bring them in hoops and maybe baseball, and you work out the contract from there. For UConn, is this an all-sports thing, or do you foresee it being men's and women's basketball and everybody else fends for themselves?
I mean, no disrespect to the Big 12. If it's basketball, it's got to be football too. Because if we're talking just basketball, then call the ACC and create some kind of new conglomerate ACC where we can just come in as a basketball power and keep football as an independent. But I think football is got the tools in terms of the coaching staff. You got former NFL coaches. We got an SEC coach as a defensive coordinator. Was at Mississippi State. They're a middle of the road defensive team. But at UConn, that might be the best defensive coordinator we ever had. So they're getting transfers. There's been a consistent effort to get NIL efforts, to get a quarterback like Nick Evers, who was an Oklahoma guy and was a 4-star recruit. So they're making those investments. I can't see them making those investments and staying an independent, or to some reports going more small time and throwing football in the MAC with like UMass. I just don't see that being a possibility.
For the Big 12, Brett Yormark has said that he had conversations with UConn and Gonzaga. This is all reporting from Andrew Marchand, where he says, direct quote, "I did have conversations with UConn and Gonzaga, and unfortunately things didn't work out, only because the dream scenario unfolded for us, so those conversations are no longer." Now, that was a year ago when the Big 12 added the 4 schools out west. They were looking to add those 2 basketball powerhouses, and then something else fell in their lap at the death of the Pac-12. And maybe that happens again as the ACC begins its collapse. Let's talk about that next and flip the table, talking Big 12 perspective here on Locked On UConn and Locked On Big 12, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is summertime, and that means spending. And thankfully, Ibotta has got you covered. Sandals, sunscreen, snacks for the kids. You're going to the beach. And every time I go to the beach, got to pay for parking. I got to buy this, and I got to buy that, and a couple of Miller Lights. And Ibotta's a free app that lets you earn cash back every time you shop. Earn on hundreds of items, from groceries to beauty supplies to even toys, so you can make sure you're beating inflation no matter what you're purchasing. The average Ibotta user earns $256 per year. That could cover the cost of an entire shopping trip, the flight you've been eyeing, the fancy dinner you've been craving, all at Ibotta. That you can save on 2,400 brands over that with 1,000 retailers, including Macy's, Sephora, Best Buy, and more. Right now, Ibotta is offering listeners $5 for trying Ibotta by using the code LOCKEDONCollege when you register. Go to the App Store, Google Play Store, download the free Ibotta app to start getting cash back. Use code LOCKEDONCollege, that's IBOTTA, in the Google Play or App Store, using code LOCKEDONCollege with Ibotta. Mark Zanetto of Locked On UConn, hearing reports that UConn will join the Big 12 as a member of this conference. I want to flip the table a bit and give you the opportunity to ask the questions of how this affects the Big 12 from our side of things. What is the number one thing? What is top of mind for UConn when you think about joining the, quote, truck stop conference?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So I think my biggest question to you, and when you get to Big 12 Media Day, maybe you can ask this question, even just for your own, your own teams. The Big 12 is stacked with power programs, physical teams, Cincinnati's, Kansas, West Virginia, the travel, the absolute, beating each other up. It's like a heavyweight fight every game. If you look at some of these games, the spreads are like 4 or 5 for no matter whether you're the 12th team or the first team. How would UConn, or I should phrase it more like, why would UConn want to go to the Big 12 and have to play 16 to 18 quad 1 games and essentially kind of fall apart in the tournament because you're just beaten to crap?
There was a stretch there, Mark, where the Big 12 was dominating at the Final Four level, from Texas Tech going to the championship against Virginia, and then Kansas running the table. You look at the 2020 canceled season. I think Kansas with Azubuike or Baylor, and what they had with Jared Butler and Maceo Teague and everybody that was back in 2021 to help them win a championship. And Kansas in 22, there was a stretch there where it was the narrative that the Big 12 can't win in March because it's so tough in the regular season, and that narrative was completely canceled out. And the last 2 years haven't exactly reflected that. The Big 12 has been a bit of a flop in the postseason, but if you want to be in the best conference in college basketball, it's really not close. You ask Sportico, you ask Massey ratings, you ask anybody, and the Big 12's got the best conference in basketball, especially when teams like BYU became surprisingly competitive, or Cincinnati or UCF, who both missed the tournament but snuck up on teams like Kansas and pulled major upsets because they had pieces that were competitive and successful. Then the top of the conference, you already mentioned, there's Iowa State there. There's TCU there, who's so competitive now. Now, Arizona is in your conference, and you bring in the likes of Colorado, who's at least competitive last season. That's not to mention the Baylors, the Kansas of the world, and what they've given the conference for the last few years. And programs with history like Oklahoma State that have frankly sucked, but at the very least, they have the basketball is there. And maybe for me, and I know that I'm so interested to hear the questions that UConn would have. The one thing that I question on the Big 12 side, if it's adding UConn, is less so from a competitive nature what it adds to the conference, because obviously it does. the Big 12 having a UConn, having Gonzaga is going to make basketball even better, an elite product somehow more elite. Then you go to revenue. You say, all right, you got the chops. Do you have the money to back it up? UConn is the only school in the country over the last couple of seasons that has spent more money on basketball than football and profited a lot more money off of basketball than football. And the EADA numbers from 2022, which gives you it's kind of, we work 2 years back when it comes to government numbers and revenue. And for UConn, I mean, they're in the thick of it with the Illinois, the Indianas, the Michigan States, the North Carolinas, when it comes to basketball revenue at $24 million per year. Then you look at a Syracuse at $34 million or a Duke at $45 million. You say, hey, if you're the Big 12 and the ACC falls apart, why not add Duke? Why not add Syracuse, who actually make more money off of football than UConn does and could bring you more revenue? So I don't know if I even think about it from a competitive standpoint, more so than I do a revenue standpoint. How much money can UConn bring you?
Yeah, I also wonder too, just about if we take away, it's hard to take away money in college athletics these days, but if we look at the competitive landscape of the Big 12 from the Big 12's perspective, does it make sense to add another superpower to that mix? Where you're right, over from 2019 to 2022, they had a nice run where you had Kansas, Texas Tech. You mentioned all that, but last year, if you saw it, I mean, you had Bill Self go on, like actually say that he was already looking at next season because his team was hurt. I felt like they beat each other up to the point. Like I feel like even Iowa State, if they had beaten Illinois, they probably would have got beat by 30 against UConn in that team. That team looked exhausted after that Illinois game in the Sweet 16, and they barely lost. So it's just one of those things where I just wonder. I think some fans on our side would have that same thought process, but as far as like recruiting goes, do you feel like the conference footprint would be benefited by having a team in the Northeast? Is that something that is even thought of in your perspective?
Recruiting standpoint, the league itself is so sporadic now because you have UCF and you have BYU, you have West Virginia, and you have Colorado. So where you recruit and the hubs that you reach from, you don't see a ton of these schools going and grabbing a kid out of Chicago or the Chicago area in a high school setting. And you don't really see these schools going to Brooklyn and grabbing this kid from a high school and say, well, there's really good basketball. Instead, you're seeing a lot of, hey, what does IMG got for me? What does Link got for me? What does Sunrise Christian have for me? How do these prominent basketball prep programs give us star recruits in the conference? Baylor's doing that. Houston's doing that. Kansas is doing that. I think what you see more so now, just in the sport of basketball in general, is schools turning to the prep academies and the transfer portal and saying, look, I don't care where you went to high school, but you're a 3-year starter from Western Kentucky. You're a 2-year starter from Toledo. You're the MAC player of the year. You're the SoCon player of the year. You scored 26 points per game and shot 48% from three. We need you. We want that in our program. And maybe you're coming off the bench, but that's what recruiting seems to be now, more so portal focused, more so academy focused than it is necessarily regionally. And maybe UConn's seen a bit of that too.
For sure. They've had a lot of success over the last couple of years, picking a Tristan Newton from East Carolina, picking Cam Spencer from Rutgers. This year they got Aiden Mahaney from St. Mary's. So you're right. There's that stuff. There's definitely a part of it, but the strategic aspect of recruiting is still part of it. I wonder, I'll ask you one more question about the Big 12 and kind of the long-term vision. If this happens and we use that imminent word in the next couple of weeks, do you think that if this offer has already been made and they're working this all out behind the scenes, do you think that they see UConn as a strategic fit, like where they're betting on the football program being to a level that Kansas is at, to where Duke is at, where it could get to that point? Because UConn wasn't always in the doldrums of the football program. They were a good team in the Big East when Big East had football. This is it's 20 years ago, but in 2004, they were in the Fiesta Bowl, 2003 or 2004 in the Fiesta Bowl against Oklahoma. So it's not impossible for this to happen at UConn, where they're a competitive football program. Maybe, and hell, who knows? In 2003, they would have been in the college football playoff. That's how crazy this world is. Yeah. So if we were in the 12 team expanded playoff world that we're in now. So do you think that that's part of it, that they're looking at it as like, all right, UConn is already here on the basketball level. They're here at football. If we can just get them to about here and we bet on that, that's also going to add a ton of revenue as they kind of on the rise.
Yeah, more than necessarily looking at football, what Brett Yormark wants to do, the conference commissioner of the Big 12, is look at innovative ways to bring in money. And this would be a completely basketball move. It would almost be Yormark saying, I don't care about football at this point. You guys make a bulk of money in basketball. You're at now the last decade. I mean, it goes decades back that UConn's going to be successful at basketball. This reminds me a lot of, everybody bear with me, Florida State in football, Texas in football, Alabama in football. Those are programs that can suck for 5 years, suck for 7 years, 8 years, and still make money because people pour resources into those football programs. UConn basketball can suck for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, and they are still going to bring in money in basketball because of the resources surrounding that program. That's what brings Brett Yormark's attention to that school. Less so football being even remotely competitive, and more so how can I make money off a product that Fox and NBC and ESPN want to be even more involved with moving forward. So a lot of it comes down to TV money and the TV money that basketball can bring in as these contracts expand. And the Big East is an example of how TV money in basketball can save a conference or save an entity. But I don't think UConn can do this alone. Let's move there next. Who else is coming with the Huskies? It's got to be somebody on Locked On Big 12 and Locked On UConn, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. It's August 20th. My rent is due in 11 days. And at FanDuel, I can say, hey, the Rays have been playing really well. The Texas Rangers have been winning games at some point. The Baltimore Orioles are fun. I would like to put money on them. And FanDuel says, okay, do it. That's what we're here for. FanDuel.com is your place to go right now for this is a one-of-a-kind offer. It is different. We've never done this before. Through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Yep. With a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. $5 bet. Now through September 22nd, you can bet $5 and get 3 weeks free of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Go to FanDuel.com/locked on to download America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/locked on. It's America's #1 sportsbook, and you can watch every NFL game coming to you very soon. Mark Zanetto of Locked On UConn. If the rumors are true, so again, we've used the word imminent here. It's imminent that UConn will come into the Big 12. I go back to the ESPN article from 2023 where Brett Yormark says verbatim to Andrew Marchand, I did have conversations with UConn and Gonzaga, and unfortunately things didn't work out only because of the dream scenario unfolded for us, so those conversations are no longer. Now, a year later, now that those 4 schools in the Pac-12 have been added, it seems as though the rumor mill in the last 6-8 months is that UConn and Gonzaga are back in the fold. You don't host Locked On Zags. Like you're here representing Locked On UConn, but it feels like from a lot of the reports, that's a package deal. In expansion, you've usually got to have a buddy, a partner. Is that partner Gonzaga?
Yeah, I believe it would be. In particular, when you start talking about the revenue that UConn brings just on basketball and how Yormark doesn't really care whether football is a part of the mix. So they're not going to pair with Oregon State. They're not going to pair with Washington State. That's just not going to be their partner in crime here. I think, if there is a basketball power that's never won a national championship right now, it's Gonzaga. And UConn and Gonzaga are intrinsically linked from 1999, where that 99 team that UConn made the Final Four and won, that was their first Final Four. It was also our emergence of Gonzaga in that Elite Eight. They were a 10 seed. Dan Munson brings them on this, historic ride. And that was the beginning of the Mark Few era. And it was the kind of the coronation of Jim Calhoun kind of getting what people always knew, that he was a great coach, and getting to his first Final Four and then eventually his national championship. So I think there's too much symmetry there to kind of not have the two of them join a conference together. And it's also 2 schools where basketball is king. There's no, we call our place the basketball capital of the world. I would imagine they feel pretty similar in Spokane.
The ACC looks shaky. rocky at best, with Clemson and Florida State suing. They're likely going to leave the league. And from there, Duke and North Carolina and Virginia and a lot of the power schools want to be on the table, want to play their hands somewhere else. Is there a way in which UConn hitches its wagon to a Duke, hitches its wagon to maybe a North Carolina? That's a much bigger brand. North Carolina is huge because of the Jordan brand, but one of those ACC schools helps segue UConn into the Big 12.
I could see Duke, and I know our fans will hate that because our fans hate Duke fans, and I don't blame them. But it's one of those things where if we're talking a partner that makes a lot of sense, you can't really hitch your wagon to North Carolina unless you're bringing state with them. It's because it's a state school, like it's the North Carolina institution. You're not gonna. I don't think Carolina's going to a conference without making a deal with state. So
yeah,
I think there could be a scenario where they hitch it to Duke. I don't know if there's kind of like a possibility to have even more people go to the Big 12. I just don't see more than them hitching with one partner, and I think it's Duke. If we're going to add an ACC school versus a Gonzaga, a WCC school, I think that would make more sense. It would be, I kind of would stick my nose up at it because it's kind of like making a deal with the devil, no pun intended. Yeah. But yeah, I would see Duke over Carolina there.
Given the option, if you're the Big 12, let's make you the Big 12 commissioner for a second.
Okay.
Given the option, UConn is on the table with Gonzaga. That's a package deal. And you find out, hey, the ACC is falling apart, and NC State is there, and Duke is there, and maybe you could get Syracuse. You probably are out of the range. North Carolina, Virginia feel like Big Ten programs based on their AAU status and where they're looking to go. But, hey, Miami's here, and they bring the football aspect. How does UConn separate itself from some of those brands that carry a lot of weight in both football and basketball?
I don't know if my fan base will be excited about this, but I don't think they do. I say that just from if we're talking dollars and cents, would you say UConn made a profit of $24 million on their basketball program?
Yeah,
that's amazing. But the fact that Syracuse made $10 million more, and Syracuse is terrible at basketball at this point.
This was those 2022 numbers with Syracuse even then wasn't great, right?
So, it's money talk. We can't curse on the show, but money talks and other things walk. So it's one of those things where like it doesn't make sense. It makes sense in the value perspective of creating one kind of, or not one, because they'd be a part of now a basketball power conference, but kind of bringing the king of college basketball, at least over the last 2 years, maybe over the last 10 or 20 years, depending on how you look at it, to the Big 12, and essentially saying there's irrevocably the best basketball conference in the country. If that's what you want, if that's what you want to create, like you could never argue it now. Like if you brought UConn in next year, and let's say UConn wins a third straight national championship, what are they going to say? You know what I mean? So I could see that being a draw, but when it comes down to you're just the commissioner and you're looking at it from a value perspective, you're bringing in NC State because they have a top 20 football program. You're bringing in Duke because Duke is a basketball power, plus they throw a top 25 football program occasionally once every 5 years. So you get a little bit of everything from these programs. So yeah, I mean, I love UConn, and I think the gamble better be about creating a basketball superpower, and that the football program is on the come up.
This one's tough. 10 years ago, the university pitched itself to the Big 12, built this entire public domain PDF about how UConn should be a Big 12 school. This is in one of the last rounds of realignment, and obviously the Big 12 balked then. What is different now? Do you feel like UConn has a different power or a different leverage than it did in 2016? Granted, it had still won multiple national championships in the 15 years prior to that.
Yeah, I think it's going to sound corny, but Dan Hurley kind of moves mountains right now. He is the type of guy that is kind of the voice of college basketball at this point. And again, I know my fans won't be excited about me saying, like, when Coach K kind of bestows that upon you in his podcast and was like, listen, you're the guy now. That kind of is, it's like being knighted, right? And I think that means a lot. And I think if you're the commissioner of the Big 12, that doesn't get you dollars, but what it does is it kind of does. I mean, there's streaming aspects to the Big East's new deal that potentially the Big 12 can add to the mix with having that Northeast connection, and that New Jersey, New York connection as well, that tri-state area. I think there's dollars there that you don't get with Syracuse. You definitely don't get it with Rutgers. People can talk about that all the time, but no one watches Rutgers. So it's like, UConn has eyeballs. You also get the, women's basketball is never been more popular, and us folks in the nutmeg state would say, what's took you so long? Because there's a lot of great women's basketball teams that have gone through the University of Connecticut. So I think that it's the Dan Hurley effect. You get the greatest women's basketball program that ever lived, and a time where women's sports are at its highest.
Mark, for listeners of Locked On Big 12 that like your work or want to see more of it, where can they go?
Yeah, you can follow us just like your show on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, wherever that is. Just go to Locked On UConn. You can follow me. You can see the tag here at Mark Zanetto CBB, or you can follow both, which is at Locked On UConn. We have an X handle there too, so got to pump up those numbers as well. But yeah, I would love to have any of your Big 12 folks listen to the show. Especially if we're maybe coming. We'll see.
That's what I was about. It's for all the UConn fans. When your school's in the Big 12 in 10 days, I'll see that we'll do another crossover, and I'll see all you guys very soon on a lot of Locked On Big 12 shows. This has been and always will be Locked On UConn and Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Dose Grande.